The Wilhelm Gustloff, packed with German refugees, set sail. 9 hours later, the ship of hope became a ship of despair.
A massive ship, 684 feet long, sits at the bottom of the ocean, holding the secrets of 9,000 people. It was a floating palace that became a scene of absolute chaos during the final days of the Second World War. The Wilhelm Gustloff was supposed to be a symbol of power, but it became a symbol of desperation.
We knew that the ship sunk in 50 minutes, and then we worked backward to understand the timeline to get from when the torpedoes hit to when it sunk.
And get this, the number of people who didn't make it is higher than the populations of some entire towns. It's a story of mistakes, shadows, and a secret that was kept for far too long by both sides. Giant of the Northern Sea. The story of the Wilhelm Gustloff begins long before the war, in a world that wanted to show off its strength through luxury. Back in 1936, workers in a massive shipyard in Hamburg started building something the world had never seen before. This ship was not just a boat, it was a floating statement. It stretched 684 feet long and 77 feet wide. To give you an idea of how big that is, it is almost the size of 2 football fields put together. The government spent 25 million Reichsmarks to build it. That was a mountain of money at the time, and they wanted every penny to show. The ship was part of a program called Strength Through Joy. The goal was to give regular working people a taste of the high life so they would support the government. Most ships at the time had different classes where the rich stayed on top and the poor stayed in the bottom. But here's the catch. The Wilhelm Gustloff was built to be a one-class ship. Everyone had the same kind of room, and everyone ate in the same dining halls. It was meant to look like a paradise where everyone was equal. There were 489 cabins that could hold about 1,500 passengers. It had a beautiful swimming pool, a modern gym, a theater for movies, and massive open decks for people to soak up the sun. For a few years, it actually worked like a dream. The ship took people on amazing cruises to places like Norway and the Mediterranean Sea. People who had never left their small towns were suddenly walking on plush carpets and looking at the ocean from a giant luxury liner. But what most people don't realize is that all this beauty was just a mask. While the ship was taking people on vacations, the world was getting ready for a massive fight. The Wilhelm Gustloff was a tool for the government to make people happy while they prepared for something much darker. When the Second World War finally broke out in 1939, the music on the ship stopped. The luxury liner was pulled into the Navy and its bright colors were covered up with dull gray paint. It became a hospital ship for about a year. Doctors and nurses replaced the cruise directors, and the theater was turned into a place for the wounded. After that, it was moved to a harbor called Gautenhafen, which is in modern-day Poland. For 4 long years, it just sat there. It was used as a floating barracks for young sailors learning how to work on submarines. Over 1,000 trainees lived on the ship at any given time. The fancy furniture was moved out, and cold metal bunks were moved in. By the year 1945, the war was coming to an end, but things were getting very scary for the people in the East. The Red Army was pushing forward very fast, and millions of people were caught in the middle. They heard terrifying stories about what was happening to people who stayed behind, and they were desperate to get away. The only way out was across the Baltic Sea. This led to a massive plan called Operation Hannibal. It was one of the biggest sea movements in human history, involving 2 million people. The Wilhelm Gustloff was called back into service to be a savior for these people. So here's the deal. The ship was never meant to hold as many people as it did that January. The docks were a scene of total madness. People were carrying everything they owned in the small bundles. Mothers were desperate to get their children on the ship because they saw it as their only hope. Officially, the list said there were about 6,000 people on board. But the crazy part is that thousands more just pushed their way through. Some people even climbed up the sides or were handed through the windows. By the time the ship was ready to leave, there were over 10,000 people packed into a space meant for less than 2,000. They were sleeping in the hallways, sitting on the stairs, and huddling in the empty swimming pool. The ship was so heavy with people that it sat lower in the water than it ever had before. Everyone on board thought they had made it. They thought the ship would take them to safety and they would be away from the war. But they had no idea that they were stepping into a floating trap that would soon become a nightmare. The weight of 10,000 souls was a heavy burden for a ship that was about to face a hidden predator. Noah's Ark of the Damned. As the sun began to fade on January 30th, 1945, the Wilhelm Gustloff finally pulled away from the dock. The weather was hands down some of the worst the region had seen in years. The temperature was 0 degrees Fahrenheit and the wind was screaming across the water. The sea was full of ice floes, which are big chunks of floating ice that can rip a hole in a ship. Inside the ship, the air was hot and smelly because there were so many people packed together. But outside, the air was so cold it could freeze a person in minutes. The ship was being run by 4 different captains, and that was a recipe for disaster. Usually, a ship has 1 person in charge, but this time there were 2 civilian captains and 2 military officers. They could not agree on how to get the ship to safety. One of the military leaders, a man named Wilhelm Gustloff, wanted to stay in shallow water. He thought that if they stayed close to the beach, the enemy submarines wouldn't be able to reach them. But the senior captain, Friedrich Petersen, was afraid of the ice and the mines in the shallow water. He decided to take the ship out into the deep part of the Baltic Sea. And get this, the ship was almost completely alone. There were supposed to be several other ships to protect it, but most of them had engine problems and had to stay behind. Only 1 small torpedo boat called the Low was left to watch over the giant liner. This was a huge problem because the Baltic Sea was crawling with Soviet submarines looking for targets. The Wilhelm Gustloff was over 600 feet long and was moving at about 18 miles per hour. It was a giant target moving slowly through a dangerous area. Then, things took a turn for the worse. The ship received a radio message saying that a fleet of minesweepers was coming toward them. To make sure they didn't crash into each other in the dark, Captain Petersen ordered the navigation lights to be turned on. Suddenly, the ship was glowing with red and green lights. It was like a giant signal in the middle of a pitch-black ocean. The younger officers were terrified and told him to turn the lights off, but he wouldn't listen. He didn't know that those lights were being watched by eyes from beneath the waves. A Soviet submarine called the S-13 had been lurking in the area for days. The commander, Alexander Marinesko, was a man who wanted to prove himself. He saw the lights of the Wilhelm Gustloff and couldn't believe his luck. He started following the ship, staying just out of sight. He followed it for 2 hours, getting his torpedoes ready. He saw the massive size of the ship and knew that hitting it would be a huge victory for his side. He didn't care that the ship was mostly full of refugees. He saw a military target and he was ready to strike. What most people don't realize is that the ship was technically a military target because it had guns and it was painted gray. It wasn't allowed to have the red cross on it like a hospital ship because of those guns. This made the tragedy even more complicated. The people inside were mostly women and children, but the outside of the ship said it was a warrior. Marinesko steered his submarine into the perfect spot and waited for the right second to fire. The people on the ship were trying to stay warm and get some sleep, thinking the worst was over. But in the dark water below, the machines of war were being aimed directly at their hearts. A silent hunter was about to unleash a storm that no one would be able to survive. Strike of the Soviet S-13. At exactly 9:08 in the evening, the peace of the night was shattered forever. Marinesko gave the order and the S-13 fired 4 torpedoes. 3 of them were headed straight for the Wilhelm Gustloff. They were traveling fast through the freezing water and there was no way for the big ship to dodge them. The first torpedo hit the front part of the ship near the bow. The explosion was so loud that it could be heard miles away. It tore a massive hole in the metal and water started rushing in at a terrifying speed. The second torpedo hit the middle of the ship right where the luxury swimming pool was located. This was one of the most horrific parts of the story. Because the ship was so crowded, over 300 young women were sleeping in that empty pool area. The torpedo exploded right beneath them. Almost every single one of those women was lost in a second. Only 3 of them managed to get out. The third torpedo hit the engine room toward the back of the ship. This was the final blow. It knocked out all the electricity and the ship went completely dark. The crazy part is what happened next. Within seconds, the ship started to tilt to one side. Panic spread like a wildfire through the dark hallways. People were screaming and trying to find their families in the blackness. Because it was so cold, the lifeboats were frozen to the deck. The sailors tried to use axes to break the ice, but it was taking too long. Some of the lifeboats were launched, but they were so crowded that they tipped over. People were jumping into the water, but the water was 39 degrees. That is cold enough to make a person lose consciousness in just a few minutes. So, here's the deal. The stairs were blocked by thousands of people trying to go up while others were trying to go down. It was a total breakdown of everything. Some of the people on board were soldiers who realized there was no hope, and they chose to end their own journeys right there rather than face the ice. Others were trampled in the rush to get to the top deck. There are stories of parents who were separated from their children in the dark and never found them again. It was hands down the most chaotic and terrifying scene you could ever imagine. The ship was tilting more and more every minute. The people who made it to the deck saw a terrifying sight. The ocean was full of ice and the wind was blowing at freezing speeds. Those who didn't have life jackets had almost no chance. Even those who did have them found that they didn't work right in the rough, icy water. Mothers were holding their babies above the water, hoping for a rescue ship that was still miles away. The cries for help were so loud that the survivors said they could still hear them in their dreams decades later. As the giant ship began its final dive, the secrets it was carrying started to bubble up to the surface. Conspiracy in the Baltic. While the ship was sinking, many people believe it was carrying more than just refugees. This is where the story gets even more mysterious. There is a wild theory that the Wilhelm Gustloff was carrying the famous Amber Room. This was a room made of 6 tons of amber, gold, and jewels that had been taken from a palace in Russia. It was one of the most valuable treasures in the world, and it disappeared at the end of the war. Some people say they saw heavy crates being loaded onto the ship under the cover of night. They think the government was trying to sneak the treasure away to a secret spot. And get this, if the Amber Room was on that ship, it would be worth over $500 million today. Divers have been trying to find it for years, but the wreck is a very dangerous place. It is at the bottom of the Baltic Sea and the water is very dark and cold. The ship has also been blown up in some places by people looking for secrets. Some think the crates were filled with gold bars stolen from banks across Europe. They believe the ship was a floating vault meant to save the riches of a failing empire. It's not that simple though. There are also theories that the ship was carrying secret scientific papers or maps to hidden underground bunkers. Some researchers think the Soviet submarine didn't hit the ship by accident. They believe they knew exactly what was on board and wanted to make sure it never reached its destination. This turns the tragedy into a spy movie. Was the ship a target because of the people or because of what was hidden in the lower decks? We might never know for sure because the ocean doesn't give up its secrets easily. Basically, the idea of hidden treasure makes the story of the Wilhelm Gustloff even more haunting. If there was gold on that ship, it is now sitting at the bottom of the sea, guarded by the ghosts of 9,000 people. Some divers who have gone down to the wreck say they felt a strange energy there. They found old boots, suitcases, and children's toys scattered all over the sand, but they haven't found the Amber Room yet. This leads to more questions. If it wasn't on the Gustloff, where did it go? Or is it still there, hidden behind a wall of rusted metal? Another wild theory is that the ship was part of a secret plan to move high-ranking officials to South America. They think some of the people on board weren't refugees at all, but people trying to escape justice. They would have used the chaos of the sinking to disappear and start new lives. This would mean that some people who were reported as lost actually made it out and lived in secret for years. While there is no proof of this, it shows how many questions still surround that night. The mystery of the cargo is just as deep as the ocean where the ship now rests. But even without the gold, the real cost of that night was something that money could never buy back. Truth at the bottom. The Wilhelm Gustloff sank bow first into the dark water, disappearing into the depths of the Baltic Sea with a speed that defied the imagination of those watching from the few lifeboats that had managed to clear the hull. By 10:20 that night, the massive vessel was gone, leaving behind nothing but a churning vortex of ice-cold water and the screams of thousands of people fighting for a few more minutes of life. In the end, about 1,200 people were pulled from the water by rescue ships that arrived too late to do much more than pick through the wreckage. But the crazy part is that over 9,000 people were gone. That is a number so big it is hard to even think about. It is the same as if a whole town just disappeared in 1 hour. Most of those people were never found. They stayed with the ship at the bottom of the sea, becoming part of a tragedy that the world would largely choose to forget for the better part of a century. To understand the scale of this, you have to picture the scene at the port of Gottenhafen. It was January 1945 and the world was falling apart. The Red Army was closing in and thousands upon thousands of refugees were desperate to escape the advancing front. They were terrified, freezing, and willing to do anything to get on a boat heading west. The Wilhelm Gustloff, which was originally built as a luxury cruise ship for the Nazi Strength Through Joy program, was their only hope. It was designed to hold around 1,500 people, but on that final night, there were over 10,000 souls packed into every square inch of the ship. People were sleeping in the hallways, in the stairwells, and even in the drained swimming pool. What most people don't realize is why this was hidden for so long. After the war ended, everyone was busy trying to rebuild their shattered lives and nations. The geopolitical map was being redrawn, and the horrors of the Holocaust were coming to light, rightly taking center stage in the moral consciousness of the world. In that context, the sinking of a German ship full of refugees didn't fit easily into the narrative. The winners didn't want to talk about a disaster where they were the ones who fired the torpedoes. The Soviet Union, whose submarine S-13 had delivered the fatal blow, saw it as a legitimate military target because the ship was carrying some military personnel and was armed with anti-aircraft guns. To them, it was a victory, but not one they felt like bragging about to the international community, given the thousands of women and children who drowned. On the other side, the losers didn't want to talk about it because it was a reminder of their total defeat and the catastrophic consequences of the war they had started. For many years, it was like the ship never existed. There were no movies made about it in Hollywood, and it wasn't in the history books that children read in school. It was a secret that both sides agreed to keep, buried under the weight of the Cold War and the collective trauma of the mid-20th century. But here's the deal. You can't keep a secret that big forever. The weight of 9,000 ghosts eventually becomes too heavy to ignore. Survivors started writing down their stories in journals and private letters, passing them down to their children. They talked about the cold that felt like needles against their skin and the darkness that seemed to swallow the entire world when the ship's power failed. They talked about the fear, not just of the sinking, but of the realization that no one was coming to save them. They wanted the world to know that 9,000 people were more than just a statistical anomaly or a footnote in a military report. They were real people with names, families, favorite songs, and unfinished lives. Eventually, the story started to come out as the Iron Curtain began to rust and the survivors reached their twilight years. Books were written, documentaries were filmed, and researchers started looking into the cold, hard facts of the sinking. They found that the loss of life was even worse than anyone had previously thought, making it the deadliest maritime disaster in human history by a staggering margin. The ship itself had an ironic history. When it was launched in 1937, it was supposed to be a symbol of a new era of German prosperity, a floating palace where the working class could enjoy the luxuries of the sea. It was a ship of joy meant to show the world the soft side of a regime that was already preparing for a brutal conquest. To see it end as a ship of death is a poetic and terrible irony. On that final night, the ship was a floating nightmare. The temperature outside was well below freezing and the Baltic Sea was filled with ice floes. When the 3 torpedoes struck, the scene inside the ship was one of pure chaos. The first torpedo hit near the bow, the second hit near the indoor swimming pool where many women were stationed, and the third hit the engine room, plunging the vessel into darkness. Because the ship was so overcrowded, there was no way for everyone to reach the upper decks. Many were trampled in the dark, and others were trapped behind heavy watertight doors that had been closed to try and slow the sinking. The wreck of the Wilhelm Gustloff is now a protected war grave. That means people are not allowed to dive there without a special reason, and it is strictly forbidden to remove anything from the site. It is a place of peace for the thousands who are still down there, resting in the wreckage that sits 60 meters below the surface. When you look at the map of the Baltic Sea, you are looking at the site of the biggest tragedy in the history of the ocean. Yet for a long time, there wasn't even a marker to indicate what happened. It is a haunting thought that so much history could be buried under the waves, hidden by the very water that took those lives. The ship that was built for joy ended up as a monument to the horrors of war, a metal shell holding the echoes of 1,000 screams. Hands down, the story of the Wilhelm Gustloff teaches us that history is often complicated and messy. It's not always about who won or who lost in a clean, tactical sense. Sometimes it's about the people who got caught in the middle, the civilians who had no say in the grand strategies of generals, but paid the ultimate price for them. The 9,000 civilians who drowned that night are a reminder that war has a very high price that is often paid by those who are least responsible for it. We should never forget them, even if the world tried to erase their story for 50 years. Their tragedy is a part of our collective history that we must keep alive, not out of a desire to assign blame, but out of a necessity to understand the full human cost of conflict. When we talk about the history of the Second World War, we often focus on the battles and the maps. But the Gustloff reminds us to look at the faces of the individuals who were lost in the shadows of those big events. The comparison to the Titanic is almost unavoidable, yet the differences are what make the Gustloff so much more tragic in many ways. The Titanic sank because of an accident and a lack of preparedness in a time of peace. It became a legend because it represented the end of an era of innocence and the hubris of man against nature. But the Wilhelm Gustloff sank because of a deliberate act of war in a world that had already seen too much blood. While the Titanic has been immortalized in film and song, the Gustloff remained a ghost story told in whispers. It challenges the way we remember the past because it forces us to confront the uncomfortable reality that tragedy doesn't always receive the recognition it deserves. Sometimes the most important stories are the ones that are the hardest to tell. Could a tragedy this big happen again today without anyone noticing? It is a chilling thought that 9,000 people could be forgotten so easily for decades. What do you think is the biggest secret hidden in our history books? If you found this story eye-opening, please hit the like button and subscribe for more deep dives into history.